All right, so today I want to talk about an actual mistake I made recently, not in a dramatic way, not in some life-altering way, but in a very real, human, work-related way. And what makes this situation interesting is that this mistake did not come from carelessness or laziness, and it sort of builds on what I've talked about recently. It came from a calculated risk and choosing to take action over hesitation. So there's a sizable problem that's taking place, at work, and there's a long backstory to it, which there's no need to go into the details right now. But what matters is that the issue reached a point where it's beyond what I could resolve on my own, and it had to be escalated to others and to another group. And now the way that escalation works is quite specific. So there's a particular tool that I use to outline the situation and escalate it and that sort of thing. And depending on what the situation is, it gets rooted and gets to a certain person or to certain multiple people internally. And that part matters because in my mind that day, I was fully in go mode. I was dealing with situations. There were things happening. People were waiting on me. Multiple situations were active at the same time. And this problem needed movement. And I knew it was going to move on its own if I didn't stay involved. So I had enough information that I thought I knew what the best course of action was. So I acted. And I escalated the problem through the channel that I thought made sense at the moment. And I didn't freeze. I didn't want to wait. I didn't spin in uncertainty, even though part of me felt like doing that. I made a decision based on what I knew at the time. And I wanted to push it forward. So it turns out I pushed it into the wrong place. And there was actually a different group that should have dealt with this specific problem. And it went to a complete separate path. So by sending it where I did, I unintentionally created a bunch of extra work for other people. And it's uncomfortable. Everyone's been professional about it. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it is embarrassing for me. It's a bit of embarrassment in that moment. And it didn't feel good the moment that I realized what had happened. And that sinking feeling sort of hit immediately because, I felt like I should have known better. So now in hindsight, yes, of course, there was another way that I could have handled it. And absolutely, I learned from that. Now, I could have paused. I could have gathered more information. I could have asked around from other people. I could have confirmed, the exact escalation path before putting it all together and actually pulling the trigger. And, in many cases, that is probably, the best thing to do. That is the cleaner way to do it. But that's the part that I've been thinking about ever since. In that moment, my decision wasn't reckless. It was based on the information that I had. It was based on urgency. And most importantly, the consequences of being wrong were not catastrophic. I knew that. They were not irreversible. And what, it really created was more work. That was the consequence, unfortunately for others and myself. So that's not nothing. That doesn't mean there is no consequence. But it's also not destruction. And once this mistake was made, there was no undo button. I couldn't just backtrack it. I had to immediately shift into support mode and try to figure out what I can do to stay involved to clean up this situation. I had to help the person who inherited this extra work. I had to own the outcome with the people involved, stay involved. And that's exactly how I handled it. So this is where the lesson really connects to what I talked about the other day about learning from failure. And that situation is inconvenient and uncomfortable. It's frustrating, but it's also incredibly educational for me because now I absolutely know the correct way to handle this specific situation in the future. There's no ambiguity about that anymore with me. The lesson is locked in, you know, also emotionally. So I will remember the implications of this decision, not just the specific mechanics of how to handle it. And that's the difference. A lesson you learn emotionally tends to stick a whole lot more than a theoretical lesson. The way that knowledge doesn't quite stick. So here's the part that really matters to me. Even though the outcome wasn't ideal, I genuinely believe that taking action was still the right decision in hindsight. And not because the result was good or perfect, it wasn't, but because the alternative was to be paralyzed in that moment or to slow down. And paralysis in that particular situation was not better than the lesson that I retained from it. So paralysis overall, if this is a behavior that I learn, is more dangerous than the occasional mishap. If I had hesitated out of fear of being wrong, the problem would still be sitting there. Maybe that particular client would have had a slightly quicker resolution. There would be less work for others to do and myself. But I would have preserved my comfort there at the cost of learning this important lesson and moving forward. There was the chance that this was the correct action. So instead, this is what happened. Even with the mistake, the situation has moved forward. People are involved, information is moving forward, and the correct path is clear, and the whole system, is in self-correct mode because it had to, and I'm better for it. So one of the hardest things about making this type of mistake in a professional environment isn't the mistake itself, it's this internal narrative that goes along with it. The self-criticism, the feeling that others are judging, that I should have known better. This loop that quietly drains your self-confidence if you let it. So I've learned to remind myself from this of something very important. I acted based on what I knew at the time. I wasn't ignoring information. I wasn't acting out of laziness. I wasn't being careless. And I was not cutting corners. I was making a decision under certain pressure with incomplete data, which is normal. And realistically, this is how most decisions are made. So perfect information is rare, but action is required anyway in most cases. So the real danger isn't that I made a mistake. It's that feeling this fear would have allowed me to be hesitant the next time and the next time and the next time that action is required. So because, if every misstep teaches you to freeze, eventually you'll stop moving altogether. Instead of letting this turn into something like self-doubt, or I'm choosing in this case to let it turn into refinement, a lesson. So I now know more about this particular system and how to handle it than I did before. And I understand these escalation paths better than before. I understand where to pause where I can and where to act because the work still continues. So I came away from all of this with experience and intuition. And this is what makes this kind of failure valuable. This wasn't a reckless gamble. This wasn't a careless error. It's not the way it was supposed to go, but there is a huge difference between the two paths that exist here. Calculated risk says, I understand the downside and I can live with it. Recklessness, on the other hand, is I don't bother to think about the downside at all. Whatever happens, happens. So in this case, the downside was manageable. Additional work, a little bit of embarrassment, some friction. And that's not nothing. But it's also not something to stop me from taking action. So what this moment reinforced for me was that problem solving isn't about getting everything right the first time. It's about staying in motion, gathering feedback, adjusting course, and continuing forward. Sometimes the feedback comes in the form of a mistake. And it really would be easy to look at the situation and say, next time I'll just slow down, avoid the risk. But I really don't think that's the important lesson here. I think that the real lesson is to continue acting. Continue to act, but to act with slightly better information every time. And I think that's how progress, real progress, actually happens. So you don't become effective by being flawless. You become effective by being resilient and adaptable while staying in motion, even though things don't go cleanly. So perhaps, again, the most important thing for me personally is this. I'm choosing not to attach my identity to this mistake. It does not define my competence, and it doesn't define my value. It's just one moment, and we move on, and this is normal. So if you're listening to this, I really hope it's helpful to you in your life and your work. Hope you have an amazing day. Bye for now.